Good evening. I'm Dennis Futoryan, and this is the 25th Hour. This week we have our first special guest, Nadine Strossen. She's the former president of the ACLU, Professor Emerita of New York Law School, and her latest book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, is in stores now. I would be remiss not to say that introduction severely curtails the long list of Nadine's accomplishments, but if I were to do that, we would be here all day. Welcome to the show, Nadine.
Thank you so much, Dennis, but I have to add one really important accomplishment, which is that I taught you constitutional law. You
That's
were
right.
a distinguished student and also a superb research assistant and even managing research assistant for me. So I'm very proud of that.
Thank you so much. I was just about to say, before we begin, I wanted to give our audience a full disclosure. I was one of Nadine's former law students. I was a managing research assistant. I contributed a tiny part of research to her book. I, without a doubt, consider Nadine to be one of my mentors and role models. She is just a brilliant person. So thank you for coming on the show.
And congratulations on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to start by asking about the intersection between pandemic restrictions and free speech. Considering the massive mobilization in state and local government, anti-COVID regulations concerning limiting worship, setting curfews, and limiting gathering inside private homes even, how does that square with the First Amendment's promise to not prohibit the free exercise of free speech? Examples that come to mind so far are recently court rulings in Cuomo's favor, for example, in New York State regarding Catholic and Jewish houses of worship, gym and restaurant closures, among others.
Absolutely important issue, not only in New York, but all over the country. There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of cases. And what I will tell you, Dennis, are the general legal standards that are applied to each specific fact situation, because the application depends on the particular facts and circumstances. So we're talking both about freedom of speech and free exercise of religion, both protected under the First Amendment, considered to be fundamental rights, in other words, very important rights. But even such important rights are not absolute. The government may impose restrictions or limits on these rights in certain circumstances. The government has the heavy burden of proof, appropriately heavy burden of proof, known as strict scrutiny. By the way, this got attention quite recently because Rudy Giuliani, when arguing in an election dispute on behalf of President Trump, got a lot of publicity when he was not familiar with the levels of scrutiny. But all of your listeners will now know more than Rudolph Giuliani, which is that strict scrutiny means that a court will take a close look, right? Strictly scrutinize the government's regulation and the rationale for the regulation. The government has the burden of showing that that regulation or restriction is narrowly tailored and necessary in order to promote a goal of compelling importance. Mm-hmm. Well, the goal of protecting public health and personal safety is clearly of compelling importance. So the dispute in these cases, as is true in most such cases, is the regulation necessary? Is it narrowly tailored? And a really important criterion that the courts apply, Dennis, is this restriction the least restrictive alternative that will suffice to promote the public health goals? So government has the burden of proving that, and the courts are not supposed to defer to the government. The government has the burden of proof. But to the best of my knowledge, governments have been winning all of these cases. I say to the best of my knowledge because there have been so many of them. It's impossible to keep up with all of them. Even the United States Supreme Court has been asked to impose stays on some, upholding, a lower court holdings upholding restrictions on religious gatherings, and the U.S. Supreme Court has not done that. So far, the government has a very strong track record. That doesn't mean that individual regulations should be rubber stamped. Not at all. The evidence is constantly unfolding. Factual circumstances are constantly developing.
And now you have described yourself as a free speech absolutist. Do pandemics throw a wrench in that? For instance, Trump rallies without social distancing or masks. There was one before the election in Staten Island, sans Trump, of course. But for example, Councilman Joe Borelli has been at the forefront locally in that regard, including writing an op-ed recently decrying Cuomo's restrictions, decrying school closings, and he even said that he would actually have a bunch of his family over for Thanksgiving.
Again, Dennis, the devil is in the details. To say absolutist is not to say that I maintain that free speech or any other right is always, with no exceptions, absolutely protected. Not at all. We can think of countless situations where I'm not aware of anybody who would say, for example, that bribery or extortion, which certainly are committed through speech, would constitute protected free speech. It's just that we absolutists insist that the government bears that very heavy burden of proof under strict scrutiny. And I think we have to make sure that not only are the standards that the government announces satisfying that necessary in order to promote public health, but also that they are enforced in a fair and neutral way. When it comes to religion, the First Amendment and Supreme Court decisions interpreting it have said that government has to be neutral toward religion. It can neither favor it nor disfavor it. So certainly standards that are imposed for non-religious gatherings should be the same standards as are enforced for religious gatherings. So there's a question of even-handedness of enforcement as well as necessity in terms of the regulations in the first place. And again, I can't discuss particular facts, but I would say that there are two kinds of lawsuits and challenges that could be brought. If the law suppose the law is not being enforced against anybody, that would really be a problem. But if it's only being selectively, discriminatorily enforced against disfavored kinds of gatherings or protests, that would be doubly problematic.
And I'm happy that you brought up the concept of having to apply fairness in terms of these legal doctrines. Conservatives criticize the allowance of protests during this pandemic, while everything else seems to be curtailed. Is that an attempt at protecting free speech or unequal application? In particular, Black Lives Matter protests in the beginning with lockdowns, or revelers dancing in the streets after Biden's projected win for president. How do you respond to that?
I would say, first of all, I'm going to stress again, I'm agnostic about the facts. I haven't had time to do fact checking. But hypothetically, assuming that there is a double standard being applied, that would be a problem under the Constitution. But we have to be very clear that we're comparing and contrasting apples and apples, not apples and oranges. So, for example, a religious service that is indoors is and goes on for a while is distinct from passing contact outdoors in a protest, right? Maybe those factual distinctions are relevant to the health considerations, but assume that you had two protests side by side and one is, for Donald Trump and one is against Donald Trump. Obviously, the same standards have to be enforced even-handedly with respect to both groups. This is what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of the First Amendment, Dennis: viewpoint neutrality. The government must be scrupulously neutral and neither favor nor disfavor speech or expression or protest because they like the viewpoint of the protesters or dislike the viewpoint of the protesters. That is completely irrelevant.
So now I want to shift a little bit away from pandemic restrictions specifically and more in line with the subject matter of your book. And a lot of that has to do philosophically with the concepts of how do we counter intolerance or how do we counter hate speech. Now, protesters say whether they're demonstrating against police brutality or Trump's allegedly racially tinged politics. I say allegedly because we want to strive for a little bit of objectivity here. Don't want to tip my hand for anyone to say where I lean one way or the other. But protesters say that their demonstrations are justified in the face of what they say is intolerance. Are we just having academic debates about how to protect ourselves from potentially life-threatening policies, for example, family separation, anti-abortion laws, all lives matter promotion, and are we leaving the other side, so to say, off the hook to control marginalized people's fates? Some examples that come to mind are protesters yelling at MAGA hat wearing Trump supporters, yelling at GOP lawmakers. For example, Rand Paul, after leaving the Republican National Convention, was yelled at, disrupting diners. So how would you say, what would you tell these protesters that think that basically they're justified in a little bit of their disruption?
The First Amendment protects, in addition to freedom of speech and free exercise of religion, which we've already talked about, it contains 6 separate protections of rights. By the way, this also got a lot of publicity recently when Amy Coney Barrett was not able to name all of them. Right. But again, you and your audience members will be able to do that. One of them was the right of the people to peaceably assemble. And the word peaceably is actually in the Constitution itself. Mm-hmm. So you have a right to engage in even a disruptive, bothersome, noisy protest as long as it is still deemed to be peaceful. Mm-hmm. Certainly anything that engages in violence or intimidation or threats would not be protected. And this goes back to my point earlier, Dennis, that even the most ardent free speech absolutist, including myself, including the United States Supreme Court, has said that certain kinds of expression, when they are targeted at particular audience members and intended to and do cause certain tangible kinds of harm directly, then the speech can and should be punished. So in your face, screaming especially with masked protesters around a single diner, certainly in my mind satisfies the standard for what the court calls a true threat or intimidation or targeted harassment or bullying, and that's not protected. But if they are standing sufficient distance away and declaring a general message or even an insulting, hateful message, but not in a way, here's the exact standard the Supreme Court uses for a punishable threat or intimidation: when the speaker is targeting a particular audience member, either one individual or a very small group of individuals, so it's not a general political message, and the speaker intends to instill on the part of the audience a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to violence. And notice the reasonable fear is an objective standard, not a subjective one. So if a particularly thin-skinned person feels fearful, that's not enough to satisfy the punishable true threat standard. But if a reasonable person sitting in the same position or standing in the same position as the targeted individual would feel fearful that they are going to be subject to a physical attack, that's not protected free speech, because that encroaches on the freedom of the person who's targeted. Mm-hmm. They're going to be chilled and curtailed in exercising their free speech rights, not to mention their freedom of movement, their privacy, and other rights. So as with all of these questions, I can lay out the general standards, which I think are very sensible, and then we have to apply them in particular factual contexts.
Is there an example that comes to mind when it comes to the legal standard for incitement?
Okay, so that is another category of unprotected speech. Mm-hmm. In intentional incitement of imminent violence, where the violence is likely to happen imminently. And it's so interesting because many people are shocked to learn that the Supreme Court, quite a long time ago, way back in 1969, unanimously adhered to that standard and said anything short of that cannot be a basis of punishing the speaker for allegedly inducing violence. Even if a speaker advocates violence, even if a speaker advocates breaking the law, that's not enough. It has to be intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently. The only case in the Supreme Court that has satisfied that standard came from the 1980s, when a group of young African American men had just watched the then new movie Mississippi Burning, which depicts horrific violence against African Americans during the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And Todd Mitchell was the name of this particular African American young man. He and a group of his friends had watched that movie. And Mitchell said, "Do you all feel all worked up to go get some white people?" And they said yes. And they're standing on the street, and there's a white boy walking across the street. And Todd Mitchell says, "There's a white boy, go get him." And they attacked him and beat him into a coma. That would have satisfied the standard. But anything more general, let me give you another example involving racial issues, as so many of these free speech cases throughout our history have, because it tends to be a very inflammatory and ongoing issue, raising passions on both sides. So in a case that the Supreme Court decided in 1982, but went way back to the 60s, involving a boycott of white-owned businesses in Alabama that were being boycotted by the NAACP for discrimination against African Americans as employees and customers. An field organizer for the NAACP gave this really fiery speech to NAACP supporters. And he said, "If we catch any of you breaking the boycott, we're going to bust your goddamn necks." I mean, and you're literally, in everyday speech, we would say that's a threat and that's incitement of violence. And guess what? There were some violent acts after that. Supporters of people who had violated the boycott and patronized those stores were subject to violent attacks. But the Supreme Court said the connection between the speech and the violence was not direct enough. Enough time had gone by, so you couldn't say that it was imminent. And there was also a problem in showing a specific intent on the part of the speaker. So it's a very speech protective standard, and one, I will say, Dennis, that was recently violated by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in a case that just a week ago the United States Supreme Court remanded a case involving Black Lives Matter. And those of us on the free speech side of these issues, we thought this is just that NAACP case that I told you about a moment ago. Very analogous factual situation. It arose out of a Black Lives Matter demonstration in Louisiana, where an anonymous member of the crowd that, to the best of my knowledge, the police still haven't identified, really tragically, horrifically, threw some kind of weapon, I think it was a brick, at a police officer, and the police officer was injured. That's terrible. And of course the police should determine the identity and prosecute the actual assailant. What was done in addition is that a lawsuit was brought against the leader of the Black Lives Matter who was speaking to that protest, DeRay McKesson, with admittedly not any shred of evidence that he had any connection to the assailant, and he certainly did not use language of intentional incitement of violence. And yet the lower courts upheld a very severe damages remedy against him. That is completely contrary to the Supreme Court's doctrine. And fortunately, the court just remanded that case to the lower court. Interestingly enough, saying we don't think this even satisfies the standards for tort liability under Louisiana law. You can't have guilt by association. The violent members of the individuals who carry out violence are culpable, but you can't hold culpable all the peaceful organizers and participants in the protest.
That's thank you so much for that response. And you say that the best form of response to hate speech is counter speech. For our listeners who have never heard the term, can you explain what that is?
It's a very broad term because it literally means any way that you can use your freedom of expression to counter either the existence of hate speech or any potential negative impact that it might have. And the examples are infinite, ranging from information, education, persuasion, rebuttal, debate, support for people who are targeted by hate speech, humor, irony, singing, dancing, counter-protest. But even more broadly, Dennis, I would say that the best response to hateful speech and the underlying attitudes and potential dangerous actions that might result from such speech is a whole host of non-censorial measures, not only through speech. So most importantly, we've already been talking about, and that is whenever there is an incident of actual violence or discrimination of any sort, of course the law should punish that swiftly and strongly. And in past situations, including the civil rights movement in the United States, what was really, really important was the failure of law enforcement, indeed even the complicity of law enforcement with Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist violence in the South. And one of the major contributions that was made was the involvement of the FBI and federal law enforcement to ensure that when violence, first of all, to try to prevent lynchings and other kinds of violence and violent attacks on protesters, and secondly, to punish those who had engaged in it to deter others from doing so in the future.
What the historical examples bring to mind is in the current atmosphere, and you can tell me if it's a perfect example or an imperfect one. Here in New York City with the protests, we see, and especially in light of the defund the police mantra that we are hearing, we sort of see a scaled back police response when it comes to being present out on the streets. What conservatives like to point to is when there's rioting and looting, but when it comes to protests, they're there and enforcing what visibly is some offhanded response. And looking at the statistics as well, with arrests being down and gun violence being up, do you think that that's sort of what's happening today? Is that complicity in the face of attacks on the police, would you say?
Again, I have to be an agnostic about the facts. I have not had time to look into them. I know that it is a serious concern that warrants examination. And let me tell you, Dennis, I throughout my entire adult career, I have been speaking against instances of police abuse and police unjustified violence, particularly against young Black men. I became ACLU president right about the time of the notorious Rodney King beating in Los Angeles. So this has been a recurrent, ongoing issue. But I never I try to, if I have enough time, and you're giving me enough time, never criticize those incidents without pointing out that they are the exception, right? Just the way we can't tarnish all Black Lives Matter demonstrators with the violent acts of a few, we can't and should not tarnish all brave, dedicated law enforcement officers with the wrongful, abusive conduct of a few of them. In fact, it's the vast majority of law enforcement officials who are the ones who suffer the most by having their profession demeaned by actions of a few. And there's no profession, Dennis, dare I say, even that of lawyers, which you and I share, where there haven't been people who have committed abuses. Now, podcasters, I'm not sure. Maybe all podcasters are above reproach. So, as part of my preparation for today's interview, I was surprised to see that you made a few appearances on Tucker Carlson's Fox show. I knew about your appearances on Jon Stewart, and I have such pride that one of my mentors, is also such a well-regarded person on that front. But watching the way Tucker Carlson talks with you, the interruptions and the scoffs, how do you handle that sort of debate? Is there a more recent example where you've practiced counter speech in that space? Well, I think a recent appearance that I had on Tucker Carlson, he was amazingly quiet. And at the end, he said, "You've filibustered me."
That's right.
And I said, "Well, I'm happy to give you another chance." So with every media invitation, I make a judgment. When I was head of the ACLU, I had the assistance of the ACLU's professional communication staff. You make a judgment knowing everything we know about this platform and how this host handles himself, herself, and guests. Is it going to be a net positive opportunity to convey a message to an audience that we want to reach? And I've made the judgment about Tucker Carlson that I can handle him. I have no problem getting my words across, but I think in terms of him himself, I'm assuming he's reflective of his audience, there are certain messages he doesn't want to hear. One very recent appearance, I know he had me on because I had been highly critical of some suppression of free speech on campus by liberal students who were suppressing speech that they saw. I shouldn't call them liberal. They call themselves progressive students, certainly not in the classic liberal free speech tradition. But students and faculty of the left were supporting suppression. And I certainly criticize that, but I'm not going to let him get away with making it seem as if that is the only story. So I immediately started to point out, yes, that's terrible, Tucker, but it's also terrible when you have students from the right, conservative students, who are shouting down free speech. And he looked completely mystified. He may have scoffed, as you said. And I just over the top of my head, I gave him a few examples, and he was tongue-tied. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't prepared for that. One of them, ironically, involved Donald Trump Jr., who had then just come out with a book attacking progressive students for attacking free speech. And ironically, he was speaking somewhere at some campus, somewhere in the Southwest, I believe, and he was shouted down by a group of more conservative students.
Right.
And so you talk about counter speech. One of what I usually do is addressing large audiences. Tucker Carlson and the even larger audience for your great podcast, The 25th Hour. But another form of counter speech, which really it cannot be underestimated how important this is, because all of us can and should engage in it. And that is engaging with individual people. After that Tucker Carlson appearance I just discussed, I received many, many emails, some of them just filled with various kinds of hateful slurs, but I respond to every single one of them. and in some cases with very positive consequences. Let me give you just one of many examples. So some man wrote back to me and he said, "How dare you distort the facts? You think we're so stupid that we don't know what actually went on." And he sent to me an article. He had done his research that appeared to refute the statement I had made about Donald Trump Jr. being shouted down. The article that he sent from a credible source suggested that the protesters that shut down Donald Trump Jr. were from the left. And I wrote back to him perplexed. I said, well, I had two sources, and they were both credible. One was the Washington Post, the other was another mainstream outlet. And I said, but I stand to be corrected. But here, I want you to know, I wasn't pulling it out of thin air. Here are the sources that I read. And he was so disarmed that I took him seriously and respectfully, and we ended up with a very mutually respectful exchange in which we agreed that, well, there are you may notice, Dennis, that I'm constantly saying, I don't know what the facts are. I've learned enough to know that you have to have a healthy dose of skepticism about whatever you read. But that's one of many examples I could give. David Brooks, a conservative columnist for the New York Times, who's anti-Trump, so he gets a lot of negative messages from both ends of the political spectrum. In a recent column, he said the same thing, that he answers emails that are even, especially the most critical ones, and has often developed a mutually respectful dialogue that affects both people in a positive way.
So, counter speech sounds logical when we're putting ourselves in the proverbial marketplace of ideas, but how do we effectively practice counter speech in such a polarized state where facts aren't facts anymore? Now, I'm very happy to hear that other people, once they enter a respectful realm of discussion, they calm down a little bit and they're able to start talking seriously without crazy expressions or exaggerations. And that is the goal, I would say. However, there are also, in our polarized state, I could tell you recent examples from my own personal life, particularly here in the Russian Jewish community here in South Brooklyn. It's hard to have a discussion about, let's say, Donald Trump, even pulling sources with you, without people just repeating either fake news or saying that, how can you trust, for example, the New York Times? Their journalists are shills, and, despite them winning Pulitzer Prizes and the like. And, aside from South Brooklyn here, now imagine talking to a anti-COVID restrictions protester in Michigan that's with open carried arms, for example. So how do we start reaching people in this type of polarized society?
It's a very important question, Dennis, but I really want to put it in context because survey after survey after survey indicates that the vast majority of Americans consider themselves moderate, centrist, happy to engage, craving, eager to engage in discussions with people who disagree with them, eager to end the polarization and bring about reconciliation. And it is true that we have extremists at both ends of the political spectrum who disproportionately get and drive media attention. And so it is important that we address that, but I think it's also really important that we keep it in perspective. You and I are, and the vast majority of people that we encounter are in the reasonable middle, are open to information and persuasion. And there are so many organizations and resources easily available online for how to foster constructive, respectful, productive discussions across divides. And I think a lot of them get special attention as we're approaching Thanksgiving, because these discussions occur among other places at the proverbial family Thanksgiving Thanksgiving table, and we've talked about it happening in neighborhoods, and resources that really are very concrete, that tell you how to approach an issue. You won't be, and a lot of it sounds like common sense, but it's also really good to have professionals who have spent their entire careers working on mediation and negotiation and counseling share their expertise. One of the most important things is not to be combative and argumentative. You want to approach this seeking not to win a debate, not to win an argument, but rather to enhance understanding. And the ways that and sympathetic, empathetic listening is absolutely crucial. You want to hear not only the other person's bottom line, but you want to understand why, and in particular, how do they feel? Because as you indicated, this is often not only, or maybe not even, a matter of rational analysis or facts or evidence, but a matter of feeling. I feel disrespected. I feel marginalized. I feel threatened, and so if you can break it down, and why do you feel that way, and they're very constructive exercises that I've looked at as a professor, how you could do this in classes, and there are materials available for K to 12 teachers as well. I'm very, very optimistic about it because and you can believe in my life, I've debated not only the Tucker Carlsons of this world. I've debated Bill Barr, the first time he was Attorney General, you name it, Antonin Scalia. And I have literally never encountered anybody, even the ones with whom I disagree the most strongly, on particular policies, particular government measures, particular constitutional interpretations, but we always can find some fundamental level of agreement on basic principles, basic goals. Yes, we think that public health is incredibly important. I don't know anybody who disputes that. We think that, reducing the number of people who are infected or who die from COVID, is there anybody who disagrees with that goal? No. There are just very strong disagreements about what is the best way to reach that goal, to approach that goal. And so I think it's really important to not lose sight of what we have in common as well as what divides us.
Who was your most heated, person at the other side of the table to your memory? Is there anyone that comes to mind?
The one that I actually got along with the least is Phyllis Schlafly, and I see that there's a recent docuseries about her. Younger listeners may not even remember who she was, but she was during the starting in the Reagan administration, but continuing. Her activities had started before that, but Reagan gave her prominence. She was a big crusader against mainstream feminist causes, very much against abortion rights, but beyond that, very much against the Equal Rights Amendment, very much against giving women equal access to opportunities in certain traditionally all-male preserves, including the military. So I was regularly debating her on those issues as well as others. She was against affirmative action and other positions that I saw as being essential to promoting equal opportunities under the law. And she was very unpleasant personally. The opposite of Nino, as he asked me to call him, Scalia, who was, neither one of us gave each other any slack on the points we disagreed with, but we never disliked each other as people. He used to say something, there are no bad people. There are bad he said there are bad people and good people, bad ideas and good ideas. A lot of good people have a lot of bad ideas. And he was always good people. But Phyllis Schlafly was so hostile toward me, and I heard this about other people that she debated, that she would not even sit at the same table to have dinner together before an event, which was unheard of in my experience. She would not stay at the same hotel. I mean, she basically, I will deal with you only as a debate opponent and not relate to you as a human being. And these debates usually took place on college campuses, and the students I would deal with were horrified. They had never had this experience either, and they thought she was kind of mean. But I just have to stress how exceptional that was in my experience. Even people that I disagreed with on just about everything. I remember Ed Meese and I, he was Reagan's Attorney General, and we debated each other many times, including on racism in the criminal justice system. So this goes back to the 80s, and we would be debating, is the criminal justice system racially discriminatory? Well, you can guess who argued yes and who argued no. But I remember one time we were debating at this campus of the University of Wisconsin in the middle of nowhere, a really rural campus, and we were staying in the same hotel near the airport. I can't remember which city, Milwaukee or some major city, but it was a long drive, and we had rented a car together, and he was driving and I was navigating. And maybe it was the other way around, but we got lost. And here we are. I was thinking, oh my goodness, here I am in the middle of the night, these dark roads with enemies.
Right, makes you a little uneasy.
It could have been very unpleasant, but it wasn't. We joked and we finally made our way back safely.
The whole, not sitting down with people at the same table thing is a little bit reminiscent of what's going on with some families today in our current political climate, and I just wanted to ask you this question. So I appreciate you saying that, we have to tap into the feelings of those that feel marginalized, including Trump supporters, that have, established a huge backlash to the established political order. Even before 2016, we could say it even started with Newt Gingrich's opposition to Bill Clinton and how he stirred up what later became the Tea Party. But are there any tips that you would bring with you to today from your upbringing on the debate team, for example, when you were in school as a student? Would you tap into any of those skills that you learned early on?
It's interesting that you mentioned debate, because those are very important skills in this sense, Dennis. And I had to say in this sense, because when one thinks of debate, especially competitive debate, as we do on school teams, and I'm proud to say I was the Minnesota State champion 2 years in a row in high school, so I certainly have no problem with competition. But when I stress the value of debate for bridging differences, it's a different aspect of it than winning arguments. And the aspect is that you have to be prepared to argue both sides of every issue. And in fact, in competitive debate, you do switch sides. So, what we call round, you will be arguing X, and the next round you'll be arguing not X. And that is really important, because it makes you understand that there is no single, simple, clear, correct answer to any complex question. And by definition, the important questions we're talking about are complex. So you learn to, number one, have a sense of intellectual humility. What you think is right at any particular moment may not be right after you get more information, after you have more different perspectives. You must always open your own views toward re-examination. Indeed, welcome it, right? If we're looking for truth and understanding just for our own sakes, it behooves us to hear different perspectives, be receptive to different information. And certainly, if we want to understand and hopefully persuade or at least negotiate with people who have a different perspective, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. And there's no better way to do that than to literally put yourself in their shoes and learn to what evidence support and analysis supports their position. You may remember from our constitutional law courses, it's my mantra for every course I have ever taught that in order to pass the course, let alone to get a good grade, every student has to be able to not only understand all plausible perspectives on all issues. Does that start to sound familiar?
That's right.
But also to be able to articulate and even advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues. And I find that a really important element of not only fuller understanding, what we often call critical thinking or critical analysis, but I also find it useful in today's world, Dennis, where people are so afraid of saying, quote, the wrong thing, right? Every survey shows that there is massive self-censorship by students and even by faculty members on precisely the most important issues that face us, including issues of race and gender, for fear that they will be perceived as some kind of an ist or some kind of an obe, right? Or even if you're an anti-racist, well, you're not anti-racist enough because you're not supporting defund the police. And one way to avoid that whole set of problems is for the teacher to constantly, not put it in terms of what do you think. Well, as a human being, I might care what you think, but for purposes of education, I don't care about what you personally think. In fact, I want you to be open-minded, but I want, toward that end, I need you to be able to think of it as devil's advocate or angel's advocate. I don't care what label you put on it. Dennis, state the strongest argument in favor of the conclusion that affirmative action is consistent with the Equal Protection Clause. Very good. Okay, Dennis, state the strongest plausible conclusion that affirmative action violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
And I'm getting some PTSD now of some cold calls from class. And, thank you for such an eloquent response, and I'm glad that you brought in what some would call the cancel culture of today. The social media make things worse or rather than better. Some people would say that our only hope these days, for example, is fact checks, quote unquote disclaimers that Twitter and Facebook would put on, for example, prominent officials. Of course, Donald Trump comes to mind, but, even professors such as yourself, I recall that you're a signatory of the Harper's letter decrying the inability of people trying to freely debate ideas. And so the social media, how does that play in terms of, counter speech, our ability to talk to one another?
First of all, remember the old adage, don't blame the messenger. And throughout history, every communications medium, especially when it's new, and each new medium is always much more powerful than those that have gone before, can reach a larger audience for less money and therefore spread messages more widely. And it's not surprising that every single one of them gets blamed for whatever the social ills are of the day. And so there are calls for censorship, and in most cases, actual censorship. Look how dangerous the printing press was and how it was attacked. For heaven forfend, allowing ordinary people to read the Bible for themselves. How dangerous can that be? And when the internet itself first reached public attention, Congress immediately responded with a censorship law that almost nobody voted against because people were afraid that children would be exposed to cyber porn, that people would get bomb-making information. And fortunately, in a very historic case that I'm very proud of called Reno, which was the name of Bill Clinton's Attorney General, Reno versus ACLU, the Supreme Court agreed with us and not the politicians. And that has allowed the internet to flourish, giving unparalleled voice not only to the hate mongers of the world, but to the opposite. Look at all the positive pro-human rights movements and messages that could not have gotten off the ground without the power of social media. And, to give examples that would appeal to the left, because the critique of the hate mongers and the disinformation usually comes from the left. Well, the Me Too movement could not have gotten off the ground without social media. Black Lives Matter itself is really dependent on social media. Think of all the campaigns of AOC before she became a household word. Her campaign depended on old-fashioned, pounding the pavements, but also on just, brilliant use of social media. Very inexpensive. And in fact, we've been able to see a whole host of young, minority, female, immigrant, etc., upstart insurgent candidacies that could never have afforded the costs of broadcast advertising that were able to harness the cheap power of social media. So I absolutely oppose any call to impose censorship restrictions on this medium any more than the prior media. It makes counter speech so much easier than it ever was before. And there are wonderful initiatives that are being explored through various universities and think tanks and foundations of ways to expand counter speech. And Dennis, going to disinformation, which you also brought up earlier,
Right.
It is now so easy to do our own fact checking. I don't believe, I can't say I don't believe, I take with a healthy grain of salt absolutely everything I read in absolutely every source, no exceptions. People mention the New York Times, the newspaper of record. I don't rely on it unquestioningly. On topics that I know about, I know that the Times has been inaccurate, incomplete. I think it's slanted in certain ways. So I try to read a diversity, ideological diversity of secondary sources. But most importantly, if I want to look into information about an issue, I go to a primary source. And the internet makes that so easy, for every single one of us to become our own researchers and fact checkers.
And how does
May I just say one other thing, Dennis? Because
of course.
there's this conventional wisdom, and I think because once you get a catchy slogan, it just seems true. So we all know about echo chambers and filter bubbles. That turns out to really be a myth. And I've read many studies. Your successors as research assistants have done research and found studies for me. I'll give a shout out to Michael Kazamias in particular, that debunk that so-called that myth and show consistently that people who get their information online actually consult more different sources and more ideologically diverse sources than people who get their information through traditional media. So, for example, people who watch cable TV tend to watch either Fox or CNN.
Right.
Not much diversity on either end. Whereas people who go online are looking at multiple news sources.
That's what my podcast is trying to achieve. Trying to be a alternative, place where people can get a summarized view of the week in the news in order to beat the 24/7 news cycle, because I feel like people's memories are getting shorter when it comes to what's going on throughout the week. So I wanted to also, with our remaining time, talk a little bit about the what seems to be the inevitable amendment of Section 230 when it comes to social media sites. And with the ability for people to research different things in order to be better informed on the internet, how does Section 230 play into that? Now, for the audience to be aware, Section 230 is a law that basically shields social media companies to the extent that as long as, if I'm correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Nadine, that social media companies, as long as they're making good faith efforts to screen the type of content that's coming in, they are shielded from liability.
So, not quite right, Dennis, but there's a lot of misunderstanding. So, you probably picked this up from some media source. Section 230, which has been described as the law that made the internet possible, contains two provisions. And what it does is shield platforms for liability based on what others say on their platform. So it protects against intermediary liability with some important exceptions, including federal criminal law and intellectual property. But number one, they're shielded from liability. So that means that they have no incentive. Well, let's put it this way. If they didn't have that shield, they would have an incentive to not allow third-party speakers, right? Because they would have to screen everything to make sure, is it defamatory? Is it violating privacy? And that would end the internet as we know it. That would turn us back to the old gatekeeper system of the newspapers and the finite number of newspapers and broadcast outlets, where very few of us would have a platform. That would have killed the whole, the goose that lays the golden egg, killed that goose. But the second part of Section 230 is really important, and that is that they may engage in content moderation and filtering as long as they do so in good faith to weed out what they consider to be objectionable material. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. By virtue of exercising some screening functions, they're not therefore liable for stuff that they didn't catch in the screening. And for all of the attacks on Section 230 from both the left and the right for different reasons, I hope you're wrong in your prediction that it is going to be revoked. Maybe some little tweaks would be okay. But if we want this platform to retain what has been its singular virtue, namely that ideally every single one of us, armed with a minimal amount of technology, can reach an audience of every single other one of us on a worldwide basis. That is what Section 230 allows. And by the way, Dennis, it gives immunity not only to the platforms themselves, but also to individual speakers. I mean, if you are liking or forwarding or passing on a message that turns out to be defamatory or to violate some obscure state regulation, you are exonerated you are immunized from liability. And so don't think of this as something that just protects dominant platforms. It also protects individual speakers. And it's not a special protection for the social media themselves. It is a protection that extends to the traditional media in terms of their online platforms as well. So that's a red herring that you often hear from the old stream media, that new ones are getting special treatment. Not at all.
How would you tweak Section 230 if you would?
Somebody that I greatly respect, Danielle Citron, has co-authored an article with Benjamin Wittes in which they proposed a small amendment that would emphasize the good faith aspect, the good faith responsibility on the part of the platforms. And again, I have to say, I have not thought that through in depth, Dennis. This is extremely complicated. But I so respect Danielle and Benjamin that I would give that a hard look. But that's a quite minor tweak in contrast to what's sweeping changes that are being proposed. I mean, for example, from the right, we have Josh Hawley saying that there has to be proof that they're not engaging in any conservative bias. From the left, we tend to have calls for massive suppression of what they call disinformation. And the problem with both of these concepts is that they are so inherently subjective, right? One person's disinformation is somebody else's anti-conservative bias, right?
That's right. And, I wish we had all the time in the world to talk. I know that I can keep asking you questions until the sun burns out, but I would just ask one final question. Considering our impending future, Biden being the president-elect, a 6-3 conservative majority on the court, what would you say to our audience is the First Amendment issue to pay attention to in the next 4 years?
Sorry to disappoint you with your focus on the present, because my answer is exactly what it has been throughout my entire conscious lifetime since I started thinking about free speech. And that is the single most important challenge is public attention, awareness, knowledge, concern, commitment, and advocacy. A great free speech professor, pioneer at Harvard Law School at the beginning of the 20th century named Zechariah Chaffee, one of the founders of the ACLU, said, in the long run, people will have just as much freedom of speech as they want. In other words, we ultimately elect politicians who either act in ways and pass laws or don't pass laws in ways that are respectful of speech, or we don't. And ultimately, those politicians nominate and approve Supreme Court justices who either give an expansive protection to free speech or do not. So it comes back to we, the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, Dennis, every single one of us. So thank you so much for the education and empowerment you are providing through your podcast.
Wow. What a way to end it off. Nadine Strossen, former president of the ACLU, Professor Emerita of New York Law School, and author of Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech and Not Censorship. Thank you so much, Professor. I know that you asked me not to call you Professor anymore. It's a force of habit. That's it for our interview with Nadine Strossen on the 25th hour, helping you beat the 24/7 news cycle every Sunday afternoon. Rate, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. And don't forget to become a patron today at patreon.com/the25thhournews. As always, you can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com. Follow us on most of your social media platforms and spread New York City's soon-to-be top-rated political podcast. I also urge our listeners to feel free to Google Nadine Strossen. She has a lot of other books, a lot of other articles that she has authored, and her interviews among different college campuses are gold standard when it comes to finding out more information about our First Amendment rights. Nadine Strossen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dennis.